celebrating the debut of his A History of Fear, which I was telling Luke in the back when I first noticed this book that it had a very nice blurb from Paul Tremblay, who is a terrific horror writer. He's having one of his books adapted into, I think, a movie or Netflix series. Paul called it a disorientating, creepy, paranoia-inducing reimagining of The Devil Made Me Do It tale. I was like, this is chilly. This is great for us. So I'm very excited to have you here, Luke. We'll be having his discussion first, and then if you have any great questions you would like to ask afterward, get those ready, because I will give you the microphone so you can ask them. Take it away, Luke. Thank you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's really good to see so many familiar faces. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Luke Dumas. I'm the author of History of Fear, which comes out today. So thank you for helping to celebrate my debut today. Before we get started, just want to say a few quick thank yous to Nick, the events director at Mysterious Galaxy, and his team for welcoming me back home to San Diego for this event, for the marketing and publicity folks at Atria, David Brown and Dana Johnson, my editor, Lone Lee, and my agent, Maria Whelan, and all of you for being here, and those of you tuning in virtually. A History of Fear is a literary and suspense novel about the devil. And I think some people in my life were a little surprised by that. When I first started writing seriously back in high school, I was deeply committed to ripping off David Sedaris with funny, zany essays about my dysfunctional family. And when I was a graduate student creative writing, I was known mostly for humorous fiction. So I think some of my classmates were expecting my first book to be a comedy. But a couple people in my life did know that from the beginning, my tastes were deeply disturbed. That my parents, one of the first short stories I ever wrote was called Her Lips Were Red. And it was about a battered wife who chops up and eats her abusive husband, hence the red lips. And, you know, I think my parents were a little surprised. We had teachers pulling my mom aside being like, is he okay? And my dad, for years, no matter what I wrote, no matter how many funny stories I wrote, he would always say, oh, Luke likes that dark stuff. And it would annoy me. But actually, he was right. I do like the dark stuff. When I think back on it, I've always had sort of a soft spot for the sinister and the dark, sort of vengeful spirits, blood-sucking fiends, the eyes that watch from the darkness of the woods. Equally, I've always been fascinated by the ways in which the things that haunt us in fiction are often a representation of something going on inside the character, the ways that their inner demons give birth to supernatural ones, and that's something that I wanted to explore in this book. History of Fear is about an American graduate student, Grayson Hale, studying at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, who comes to be known as the Devil's Advocate, the most notorious murderer in Scotland after slaughtering his classmate and claiming that the devil made him do it. Less than 2 years into his prison sentence, Grayson is found hanged in his prison cell, his body covered in strange markings that he couldn't have left himself. And the only clue as to what might have happened is a handwritten manuscript that is found among his possessions that promises to answer the question, was he a lunatic or did he really know the devil? So all in all, a really light, cozy read, perfect for the holidays. Tonight, I want to share a few passages from the book, but I also want to talk about the process of bringing this novel to fruition. Some people have compared writing a novel to carving a sculpture out of a block of wood, and I sort of understand why they say that. But for me, the process of writing this book was more like crafting a really creepy needlepoint. It was less about having one great idea or one hunk of wood to chip away at than having a bunch of different threads that I wanted to pull through the canvas to create a complete image, or in this case, a cohesive story. I wrote A History of Fear on and off over 5 or 6 years, and for me it was a process of finding the right threads. One thread I had right from the start was satanophobia. quick show of hands, has anyone ever heard of that, or had they heard about that before learning about this book? One person. Actually, it's surprising. It's not very common, but it is a real condition that causes people to fear not just the devil, but that the devil is after them, trying to get them or trying to corrupt them to do evil things. I remember reading about that when I was a teenager, and it really intrigued me. And it was sort of the first inspiration for my main character, Grayson. As a teenager, Grayson lived in terror that the devil was after him, and he was tormented by visions of being pursued by demonic spirits that he calls fiends. He eventually managed to overcome the condition, but not for very long. After he moves to Scotland for graduate school, he needs to cash to fund his studies. He takes a job ghostwriting a book that turns out to be a history of the devil in Scotland. And when the book starts to reawaken his satanophobia, he starts to suspect that his mysterious employer might actually be the devil himself. The question for me when developing any character, really I like to start from a point of psychology and character, how they came to be the person that they are. So when developing the character of Grayson, I thought back to my own upbringing here in San Diego. As a kid, my dad used to take me a couple of times a week to a home-based fellowship service here in Point Loma. There was nothing particularly sinister about the family that ran it. In fact, they were really nice, warm people. But it did spark an idea of having a character who might have been the son of such a family in a church far darker and more malignant than the one that I experienced. Perhaps one in which the devil is not just a metaphor for evil, but a real physical presence that is after you and always trying to get you. I'd like to share a passage from the book that speaks to the origin of Grayson's fear. When I was 13, I developed an intense case of satanophobia, a condition that caused me to not just fear the devil, but to believe that at any moment he would appear and force me to do unspeakable things against my will. Although it was several years delayed, I credit the affliction to my brother, Nathaniel. It was he who had planted the seed of fear in my mind. Nathaniel and I were far from friends. Just as my mother gloried in the cultivation of his righteousness, so he thrilled in my daily suffering. It seemed in a way to buoy him, to add purpose to a life that, due to concerns for his health, was otherwise largely ornamental. Nathaniel had longed to be an athlete. Forbidden by our mother from joining Little League or the flag football team, he took me as his sport. But far beyond the injuries he inflicted on my body, it was his words that left the deepest mark. Years before the mention of Satan's name sent me into a spiral of terror so bad that I passed out cold on the living room floor, Nathaniel convinced me the scars on my arm had been left by the devil. When no one was around, he would whisper to me about the night it happened. The details of it remain vivid in my memory, though it's hard to recall now which were Nathaniel's and which my mind invented to fill in the gaps. In any case, the lasting image is of a night like a military assault on the earth, rain hammering the house like machine gun spray, thunder exploding like falling bombs. A younger Nathaniel, 4 or 5, I imagine, lies quivering beneath the race car bedspread as the storm rages above, the roof keening and moaning as if any moment the wind might rip it clean off its rafters. Suddenly Nathaniel shoots up in bed as he hears another sound, breaking glass, followed by a slam. It sounds as if it has come from the nursery. His infant brother begins to scream. Slowly, Nathaniel creeps out into the hallway and follows the sound of my wailing. It is dark, but he can make out something on the floor, black shapes darkening the floorboards, which moan with every step. "Hello?" he calls out. A flash of lightning illuminates the hall, and for a second he can see them, a trail of black cloven hoof prints scorched into the wooden boards, leading down the hall through the open door of the smallest bedroom. Were any of this true, no doubt he would have turned back or run screaming into my parents' room. But as he told it, he continues to inch along the hallway, terrified yet spurred on by the baby's cries. As he stops in the doorway, my brother's blood runs cold. Silhouetted in the moonlight, streaming in through the shattered window, a monstrous form hovers over the crib. It's gargantuan, the size of 2 or 3 men at least, with skin the color of tar. Its legs end in glossy hooves, and great twisting ram's horns protrude from its head. Barely 12 months old, I lie in the crib, continuing to wail as the beast leans over me, drooling on my stomach as its maw gapes open. Rigid with shock and terror, Nathaniel watches on helplessly as out of the beast's mouth snakes a tongue as long as a t-ball bat. It is luminous orange, as if constituted of burning embers and forked, not 2 prongs like a snake, but 3. Lowering its head to my body, the beast drags the glowing appendage up my arm, causing me to erupt in a piercing shriek of pain, accompanied by the sizzle of burning flesh. Nathaniel too screams, the sound of it drawing the beast's scarlet eyes with a snap. Then instantly the creature explodes into a cloud of wings and claws, its enormity divided into a dozen black fiends, which gnash and screech and flee through the open window. So I had my first 2 threads: satanophobia, religious upbringing. The third wouldn't come for a few years later. I have always been really obsessed with the UK. I feel like I should have been born there. But as an undergrad at the University of Chicago, I decided I was going to spend my 3rd year studying in the UK. London was the obvious choice, but everyone in my year was going to London. Frankly, I didn't like those people very much. I was happy to get away from them. So I decided to go to Edinburgh, Scotland. I spent about 9 months at the University of Edinburgh. I loved it so much that ultimately I decided I would go back for my master's degree in creative writing there. It's kind of hard not to be inspired by the city with its Gothic spires and cobblestone streets and dark, shadowy alleyways like the one depicted so brilliantly on the book's cover. It just seemed like the perfect location for creepy atmospheric suspense where you're not sure which threats are real and which ones are just happening inside your head. Meanwhile, I was taking all of these incredible Scottish literature courses, and I was assigned to read a book called The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. It's not well known here, but it's a sort of classic of Scottish literature. And that's how I discovered this genre of Scottish demonic fiction, a literary tradition that goes back centuries to travelers' tales like Jack and the Devil's Purse and Robert Louis Stevenson's Thrawn Janet. And even to today, Scottish authors are still writing in this tradition. These stories were really interesting to me because they were not sort of the everyday demonic stories we know here. It's not so much about the possession and exorcism and priests. They sort of eschew those tropes for a more internalized view of evil. These are stories in which the devil appears, often as a principal character, described as a man dressed in black oftentimes. And he's a trickster, and he is there to sort of guide, to take righteous people or very wounded people and lead them off the path of righteousness. In the case of Justified Sinner, the main character is a minister's son called Robert Ringham, who is so convinced that he's been selected for salvation and is so determined to seek revenge on his brother and father who spurned him that he doesn't even realize that his mysterious companion is the devil in plain clothes. And the devil manages to convince him that he can become God's champion by slaughtering people he has already decided are damned, and thereby condemning himself in the process. Reading that, I envisioned a novel that turned that dynamic on its head. Instead of a character so convinced of his moral infallibility that he's an easy target for the devil's influence, a character so convinced of his innate evil that he just lives in fear that the devil is always out to get him. So with that, I had 2 more threads. Edinburgh setting and this idea of putting an American twist on this very Scottish genre. And for years, I kind of thought that that was going to be enough. In 2015, I started writing this book for the first time. By that point, I already had 4 unpublished manuscripts under my belt, each of them meticulously outlined chapter by chapter. But whereas with those projects, I saw a clear beginning, middle, end, the structure of this book was less clear to me. I decided I was just going to pull a Stephen King, try to write the thing and see what happened. I got about 50 pages in, the exact point at which my outline ended. And once again, I was stuck. I didn't know what to do with it. I couldn't see my way to the end. Eventually, I spent a few years sort of doing that, editing up to where I had, maybe adding a bit, and just finding myself stuck. And eventually I realized the reason I didn't know how to end it was because I was missing one crucial thread, sort of one essential element that connected the dots between Grayson's satanophobia, his going to Edinburgh, and the reason why he doesn't just hop on the first plane back to San Diego the first time his condition begins to come back. I was missing the why that tied it all together. So in this case, that was the emotional through line or the internal desire that propelled Grayson through the narrative and keep him going when it would be really easy to turn back. Finding that thread was a process of trial and error over multiple drafts, sort of weaving threads in and then unpicking them again when they made a mess of things. To my surprise, the thread that stuck was one of the simplest. Through all the fear and chaos that dominates Grayson's life, he is driven by a desire to be loved and accepted by his father. And once I understood this, the story began to fall into place. With that, I'd like to read one more excerpt from the book. Edmund Hale had been dead not quite a year when I moved overseas. They found his body one overcast morning, prone on a strip of rocky sand bed at the bottom of Sunset Cliffs, his limbs contorted, his likeness having parted company with his face when his head smashed a rock. Probably didn't feel a thing, one of the officers said. The funeral, which was closed casket, drew a sizable audience. Believers new and long forgotten piled in to pay their respects, more for my mother's sake than their ministers. Vera had curried sympathy by telling them my father's death was an accident, that Ed had been out walking the trail like he did most mornings. Perhaps he'd leaned over the rope to see the waves breaking at the base of the cliff, or had stumbled over a dip in the dirt and lost his balance. A tumble he couldn't immediately correct, a scream no one was around to hear. She didn't tell them about the note. I discovered it in his study, scrawled by hand on a torn-out sheet of paper, the same day they found his body. It was addressed to my son, which could just as well have been my brother Nathaniel, but some part of me knew he had meant it for me. By the time you read this, I'll have passed from one plane of misery into the next. I've resisted the urge for as long as I could bear, but as you'll one day understand, one temptation or the other was always bound to win. Son, listen to me, for nothing could be more important. Many years ago, I was forced to make a choice that has never ceased to haunt me. It has followed me from the hills and glens of Scotland, stalked me to the very edge of my sanity. How I wish I could go back and unbind the shackles of my life, discover in that country the part of myself I didn't know existed, and not flee from it, but welcome it like an old friend. It's too late for me, but there's time for you still. I pray you enter by the narrow gate. I had read the letter so many times that I could all but recite it from memory, yet it remained a mystery. The narrow gate, I believed, was a reference to the book of Matthew. But what was this choice he had been forced to make? What had transpired in those few months abroad to so drastically upend his self-view? Had it anything to do with his decision to abandon his studies, to throw away his future as an esteemed professor for a life of living room worship services and domestic imprisonment? All I knew for sure was that whatever decision he had made, it had killed him, driven him to the edge of his sanity, he had written. Driven him, I had no doubt, to the edge of that cliff. I might never know whether, if he had finished out his studies in Scotland, my father would still be alive today. But I was certain that here, and only here, I could live the life he couldn't. Only in Scotland could I become the man he never could. The final thread I would like to mention is fear, which you can probably tell by the title of the book is a pretty important one. Fortunately, I've never experienced the type of fear that Grayson does in this book, but there are plenty of people who do. One of those people is my friend Amy. Amy was actually my high school English teacher. She was one of the biggest supporters of my early writing, loved the David Sedaris ripoffs, and we had a really special relationship that lasted for years beyond my time at school. In fact, after I graduated a semester early from college, I had a few months at home before I was going to go away to graduate school. I ended up moving in with Amy. She needed the help around the house and the company, and I was happy to give it. Her health was very bad. She had congenital heart issues, multiple open heart surgeries, a pacemaker, and her health had really deteriorated by the time I moved in with her. She was emaciated, clinically malnourished, and I was just happy to be able to help her make sure she ate, provide some company, and get her, big gulps size cups of crushed ice from 7-Eleven a couple of times a day, which were her favorite thing. Her health was bad enough that she was starting to consider her mortality. She was what you would call a fallen Catholic. She had not practiced in years. I don't think she even really believed in God. But so it came as a surprise to me when one day she told me that she was terrified that when she died, she was going to burn in hell. I actually thought she was kidding. Like, what are you talking about? She reminded me about her first husband, an older man that she married when she was very young. He was abusive. The marriage didn't last long. She eventually remarried the love of her life, who sadly passed away from cancer before I met her. According to what Amy had been taught, to divorce and remarry was a mortal sin, and the punishment for such a sin was eternal pain and suffering. She knew it didn't make any sense, but that fear had been ingrained so deeply in her from such a young age that she couldn't let it go. And this was really tough for me to hear, to see this woman who really meant a lot to me, a teacher of more than 20 years who had devoted her life to public service, touched thousands of children's lives, spend her last days living in terror that she was going to burn in hell for leaving an abusive marriage. That really angered me, and it really impressed on me just how intertwined fear and religion are for some people. So for this reason and a lot of others, I dedicated this book to Amy, who passed away in 2014. She never got a chance to read it. But in her honor, I hope you will, and that it will leave you questioning your preconceived notions about the people we call evil and the institutions we trust to define what is good and moral and right in our lives. Thank you. I think we're going to take some questions, if anyone has any questions.
I'll go ahead and start with one of the questions we have from our virtual audience. So let's see here. From Lone, did you surprise yourself as you were writing your book?
Did I surprise myself? I mean, I don't know if I did. God, that's my editor, by the way. She asks me really tough questions. I mean, this book was definitely very different than I envisioned when I started writing it. I think sometimes as an author, when you have your first idea for a book, it's kind of vague. Maybe it's a vibe, maybe it's a feeling or a scene. And for me, I definitely had those, but I didn't understand yet that this was a book about fear and religion, that it was a book about personal identity and struggling to sort of reconcile personal identity within the boundaries of a very rigid, cult-like upbringing. So those things definitely surprised me in writing the book. They were things that ultimately I learned were really important to me that I didn't necessarily know as I started the process.
Next, we have from Michelle. How did you define Oops, sorry, I just lost it. How did you define your boundaries of evil and darkness for the story?
I mean, I think for me, there are no divisions between the good, the dark and the light, the evil and the good. I mean, I think I started from a point of what do we often interpret as evil and what do we interpret as darkness, as a starting point to explore a more nuanced interpretation of like, who are these people? Why are they this way? And to create empathy for people that we maybe see as dark or evil and try to write off as monsters. And I think one of the interesting ways that comes out in the book is through this, there's sort of a frame, there's a journalist. Most of the book is sort of this found manuscript, but there's also a journalist, an editor, who's sort of inserting these different pieces throughout the book. So transcripts, emails, interviews, she's sort of trying to do her own journalism to try to figure out who this guy is, if he's really telling the truth. And I think having that sort of public lens of evilness and this sort of sensational nature of the devil's advocate was kind of an interesting starting point to explore something deeper.
Thank you. Do we have an in-person audience question? Burning away. Question was, what is he working on next?
Thank you for asking that. So yeah, my second book is coming out next year, next fall. It's called The Paleontologist. It's completely separate from this book. It's a supernatural suspense and mystery book about a haunted paleontologist who returns to the Natural History Museum where his sister was abducted decades earlier, and he encounters a monstrous prehistoric spirit. It's sort of a ghost story as well as a mystery, haunted house story all mixed together with sort of a fun paleontology twist.
Wonderful. Yes, audience question.
Yep. No, every draft had its own outline. There were many drafts of the outline. In fact, like I would outline the whole book, and they're pretty robust, maybe like 10 pages of single space, like chapter by chapter. And then I would get to maybe 85, 90% of the way through that outline and realize, God, this does not work. It's still not working. The thread is not coming through, or it's not strong enough. And it would always be a process of going back to the outline and trying to take that thread out and start again.
Another virtual question we have is, what do you find to be the hardest part of the writing process, and how do you overcome it?
I find the language, I really find the language, crafting something that feels interesting and beautiful and not trite and cliche. I mean, just spending the time really crafting sentences is something that I try to do. It's not something I used to do when I was younger. I wanted the laugh. I wanted, people to enjoy it. But as I've gotten older and I'm trying to, have a more literary approach to my writing, just trying to find writing that I think is special, takes a lot of time and effort. And I do find that really challenging.
Any more in-person audience questions? We do have more virtual. Yes.
Definitely. And I think it's why it took me so long to get there, is because I didn't want it to be that simple. I wanted it to be more interesting. But ultimately, those are the stories that speak to us. Those are the issues that really dictate so much of what we do in our lives. So it made sense, ultimately, that was why it was so important to the book and so important to the character. but it did surprise me. At first, it disappointed. I was like, really? Okay, let's try it. And it worked so much better. But yeah.
This question comes from Scott. When did you find the time to write, and what is the most conducive setting to write for you?
When did I find the time to write? So I work full time. I spend most of my day writing grant proposals in the nonprofit philanthropy sector. So I write in the evenings and weekends. It can be really tough. It can be really tough to find the mental energy to really devote to it. For me, the most conducive space is just in a quiet room, not being bothered. When I lived in San Diego, that was tougher because we lived in a 1-bedroom condo and it was very small quarters, and it was COVID towards the end of it, so we were together all day. Now it's nice. I have a little writing room where I can sort of retreat to and make sure I have that quiet space to just focus.
Can you talk about the audiobook and the casting from Lone?
Sure. I'm really excited about the audiobook by Simon & Schuster Audio. They've actually cast many different actors to be in it. There are 5 or 6 actors playing different parts, which is great. I mean, when you read the book, you'll see there are all these different inserted sort of materials and all these different voices come out. So it's not just Grayson's voice the whole time. Just really excited to. I actually haven't heard it yet, but I did pre-order it. I have it on my phone. I'm looking forward to listening to it. But I've heard the voices and the samples of the actors who were involved in it. They're absolutely incredible. So many of them sounded exactly like I imagined those characters in my head. So I'm really excited to listen to that very soon.
And it's kind of a shameless plug. You can also get that on Libro.fm. They do support local bookstores for every audiobook purchase, which is weird. How do you decompress, or how did you decompress after writing the dark moments of the story?
The dark moments sometimes are the most fun. They can be their own kind of decompression. I think, the more challenging moments for me are kind of don't want to say the boring ones, but the connective tissue, the scenes of going from here to here and making things flow. Those are the things that feel more like the grind and require more decompression. Actually, the more exciting, for me, I mean, I like horror, so for me, it's kind of fun. I'm not a person who feels like when I watch a really gory or really violent film, it can, I don't know, I tend to laugh through that. So for me, that is that's decompression.
Any other in-audience questions? All right, we have some more. Yes.
Yeah, I think especially if they're writing sort of the first book, their first thing they've ever really worked on, to try not to be too hard on themselves and to not have unrealistic expectations of themselves. I struggled with that for years. Every single book I wrote from the time I was 17, I was like, this is going to get published. This needs to be published. And it didn't. And those things, they were deeply flawed because I was just learning to write. And I think if you can it's a really hard thing to do, but the more you can accept that sometimes your early projects are learning experiences, it's just better for your mental health to not feel like a failure, because there's no failure in writing a book. Most people will never do that. They might think about it, they might aspire to it, but they'll never do it. So just to even be able to do that is really an accomplishment.
Yes.
I don't think so. You sort of think about that. Nothing, like I said, deeply flawed, deep. where, it's not something that you could would be an easy fix. It would be a complete rewrite. And two, when you're starting to publish, you also have to think about market pressures and how does this fit into the market? And sometimes you might have a really special story that you love, but it just doesn't. Where would you put it in this beautiful bookstore? You would have no place. It just doesn't make sense. So I think there were some of those where I really like it. I think it was a fun idea. It was a great experience, but it just doesn't make sense to devote that kind of time to redeveloping it.
Online, Mary asks, how do you overcome those roadblocks, aka rewriting outlines and getting stumped again, etc., and what keeps you motivated?
Writing is such a lonely practice, and it can be really tough when you aren't having the success. If you're not getting the publications, you're not getting the yeses. You really have to believe that you can do it. You have people are going to tell you no over and over again, but at some point or somewhere inside yourself, you need to believe that, no, this is worth doing. This is worth putting the time into. I can see this book. I can see the people who will want to read it. I think that's just really important to being successful as an author, is that self-belief.
Another online question we have, which now that you're a published author, sir, congrats. You're going to probably get this question every time a book releases. When the movie comes out, which actor do you see playing the devil?
I actually have an answer.
Oh.
Well, if anyone has seen Bodyguard on Netflix, Richard Madden, great Scottish actor. I think he could play the devil character really well. Yeah.
Any other in-person questions? I still have some more online. All right, next one. Do you ever creep yourself out while doing research? Did you creep yourself out while doing research from this book? I know you took a lot of inspiration from Scotland, you living in Edinburgh, but any other research, I guess, did it creep you out?
Again, I find it really interesting. I mean, there are elements of the sort of history of the devil in Scotland in this book. I mean, lots of witch trials, sort of people claiming to have met and fornicated with the devil. I mean, really dark stuff that I found really interesting. It didn't particularly creep me out. I'm not I've never been, I really like the devil as sort of a fictional character, but it's not something that personally scares me. So no, unfortunately, it didn't.
So what would you say is your favorite depiction of the devil, be it TV, movie, or book?
My favorite? I mean, this is going to sound really silly, but when I was a kid, I used to love the remake of, what is it, Bedazzled? With Elizabeth Hurley. I just thought she was the best devil. I mean, very funny, not scary, but I mean, I do find that a lot of the depictions can be they can be funny or scary. It goes either way. I think there's a lot of flexibility in that character, and I always find that really interesting.
Aside from horror, is there any other genres that you would want to maybe branch out to in the future if the fancy ever struck you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in sort of not just horror, but mystery, suspense, and thriller broadly. I really like stories that blend genres, and they're not just sort of one thing that you can put into a box. So I'm always interested in sort of tying different elements together. And as I mentioned, I also wrote nonfiction for a long time. I have a few essays published. I do really enjoy that writing still. So I could definitely see doing a book of essays one day.
Any other in-person audience questions? Yes.
Nice glass of scotch.
If you could give anyone a book that you would say you the most, that obviously you didn't write, what book would you give?
That described me the most.
Or I guess even then, or a book that you wish you wrote, and dang it, someone beat you to the punch.
Oh, yeah. There's a book called The Ice Twins by S.K. Tremaine. It's just a book that I love so much. It's a thriller set on a remote Scottish island about some really creepy twins. I loved it. And the writing is so beautiful, but it's also incredibly propulsive and interesting. And I love that type of writing, something that marries beautiful language and really strong storytelling with these elements that are maybe thriller or horror or ghost story or something else. That's a book I admire a lot.
What are you currently reading or is on your to-be-read pile?
I am currently reading Hide by Kirsten White. You probably have it here. It's really good.
She's also a local San Diego author.
Awesome. Yeah. So it's a horror that takes place in a theme park. I'm a huge theme park fan, so I am really enjoying it.
Wonderful. Any last question we have for our audience? All right, Luke, thank you so much for having us be a part of your debut. Congratulations on A History of Fear. Everyone watching, thank you so much for being a part of this. If you cut in halfway or more than that, you can also rewatch this in the same link, and we'll have this re-uploaded on YouTube in about a day or so. Thank you, everyone. We're going to go ahead and end it and begin the in-store signing. Goodbye. Congratulations.
Thank you.